We've been talking about AMD's elusive B550 chipset for approaching 2 years now, with constant delays pushing it back to a point where it's hard to say whether AMD might just skip DIY B550. There have been B550 motherboards in the wild though, and we actually intentionally subjected ourselves to the shopping experience of Best Buy to purchase a CyberPower pre-built machine that claimed to have an AMD B550 chipset in its motherboard. There's one key differentiator though, and that's the A demarcation in B550A. Today we'll be looking at the first motherboard we've gotten hands-on with that possesses some form of B550 chipset, but we'll also talk about the differences between B550A, B450, B450X, and what we've managed to confirm of B550 proper, if it ever comes out. Before that, this video is brought to you by the new Be Quiet Straight Power 11 Platinum Power Supply Series, available from 550 watts to 1200 watts. The new Straight Power 11 is Platinum certified, operating more efficiently than before, reducing heat and lowering noise levels as a result. The Be Quiet Straight Power 11 Platinum is up to 94.1% efficient and meets the new low power standards of just 0.16 watts when in standby. Learn more about this high-end, noise-focused power supply at the link in the description below. So first of all, thanks to our viewer Mark, who emailed us and tipped us off about B550 boards at Best Buy. We went to one for the first time intentionally in years, and actually bought something too. So astronomical odds for both of those things to happen, but they did. And so we got a CyberPower system. It's a pre-built, and that's really the only place you can officially buy a B series in the 500s chipset right now. There's a bit of a discrepancy though between actual B550 and what you can buy in a pre-built, which has a specific A at the end of B550, and that's an important lettering difference. So AMD's B550 chipset is still rumored for a launch of this year. We've heard anywhere from Q2 to sometime before end of year, which is a big range. But motherboard manufacturers have routinely been given and have given us, as a result, dates for B550 that ended up getting pushed back. AMD tells them to have boards ready by a certain time, and then B550 doesn't happen. And that has repeated a couple of times now over the past year or so. We've been hearing about B550 for about 2 years, obviously as rumors and then eventually as credible information from motherboard manufacturers who were planning around some kind of timeline that AMD had given them. But at this point, we're not really sure how much we can trust the dates, so all that really matters is that true B550 doesn't publicly exist yet, and this isn't it. But it's a stopgap solution, and it does a few things that might interest some of you, even though you can't really buy these boards officially through retail. B550A was known internally at some system integrators as B450X originally. If you saw rumors for that, it's the same thing. But that was just an internal name. In reality, B550A exists because system integrators and OEMs wanted to have a newer chipset name on their boxes than B450. They were concerned 400 series naming would affect sales, but they also wanted something sooner than actual B550. B550A makes a compromise of enabling PCIe Gen 4 to the first PCIe slot, or whichever is routed for graphics, and for the CPU connected first M.2 slot. If you have a Ryzen 3000 CPU and a B550A motherboard, it'll support Gen 4 speeds to those slots. But it doesn't run it to every PCIe device on the board because the chipset itself does not offer any PCIe Gen 4 lanes and is a carbon copy of B450, aside from the lock being removed on CPU support. And the lock is less of a chipset thing, probably, and more of an AGESA code thing, we think, where we suspect motherboard manufacturers have been supplied with a special AGESA for BIOS for these B550A motherboards. The chipset itself is physically B450, likely with no actual difference, but the lock is real. So that's either toggled in AGESA and BIOS or in the chipset, but the former makes more sense. We don't really know how it would work at a chipset level, but AGESA we know will work. The B550A motherboards are targeting a sub $80 price ceiling, aiming to keep prices as low as possible, while true B550 boards will be more similar to B450, which had a wide range of prices across the spectrum. We have no further information on what the B550 spec will look like, other than it should be pushing for Gen 4 on the chipset, but just know that B550A and B550 are explicitly different. System integrators were also worried about future-proofing as a marketing point because the 2020 round of NVIDIA GPUs is expected to support PCIe Gen 4, and the SIs don't want customers to feel stranded on Gen 3 platforms. One other interesting thing to note here is that some of you might remember B450 initially did support PCIe Gen 4. but it was taken away by AMD because it was an accident. If you bought a Ryzen 3000 CPU and you bought a B450 motherboard with one of the earlier AGESA revisions for Ryzen 3000, or just before even, then you would have ended up with a PCIe Gen 4 enabled B450 board that would later lose that support if you updated AGESA. And the AGESA updates are often worth it. So it's kind of a trade that, unfortunately, in a lot of instances, had to be made. So when we kind of thought back about that, we were wondering if maybe B550A, maybe this ASRock board, which is a B550 AM gaming that came in the CyberPower system, we were wondering maybe it's actually just B450, except ASRock has to change the name, and then perhaps they just ran an older AGESA that would allow it to get the Gen 4 speeds to the slot without any actual movement required from AMD to make B550 a thing. But in reality, that's not what happened. B550A is an official AMD product. It is officially sold to the motherboard makers for SIs. It's explicitly for the SI, or the system integrator market, and the OEM market. And B550A also is explicitly built for Gen 4 support via the CPU, if your CPU supports it. So this is not some accident this time. It's not that they forgot to turn it off. It is a rebranded B450 chipset, to be very clear about that, but the lock is removed on that one aspect, and updating BIOS doesn't break it. We did check that. As far as the board itself, the B550 AM Gaming ASRock board is an exclusive to CyberPower right now, or at least CyberPower is exclusively using it for its systems. So from what we understand, they don't have MSI, Asus, Gigabyte, or anyone else. It's just this ASRock board specifically. And the other SIs might have other B550A boards, but we've had trouble getting them so far. But we are looking around for more. One thing we are doing is we've sent this PCB shot over to Buildzoid, who is currently working on analyzing it, and will be doing a PCB analysis for us on the VRM quality and everything else about the board, because this is actually a new motherboard. One of the first things we asked Buildzoid was, is this just a B450 board, except with a different name on it? And the answer was no. Actually, it's got some similarities to some of the cheaper X570 boards, and so he's working on analyzing that for us as a separate video. But moving on through this, as for the chipset itself, removing the heatsink reveals that the chipset is labeled as part number 1927 with N2PT30 as another significant number. We have two other of these B550A motherboards, and one of them ends in 29 for N2PT29.00. Either way, though, removing a B450 chipset heatsink reveals part number 1819 on one of the photos we have, and on the other board we took it off of, it was 1901, but both of them were 47B2 for the top number. And as far as performance, they are the same. It's all, again, B450. It's just that that one lock is different. As a reminder, remember that you're not splitting chipset lanes off to the first PCIe slot for the GPU from the chipset. In most instances, it's going to come from the CPU. The first slot will almost always run off of the CPU for GPU-connected devices, and the first M.2 device with Ryzen 3000 will also almost always, but not always, run off of the CPU for the newer Ryzen product. We ran some benchmarks on the board just to double check a few numbers, and we've got those for you here. Testing was done with 3DMark's PCIe bandwidth test. Note that this test does not show actual gaming performance. So these are not numbers you should be looking at for comparison at all, device to device, of how it performs in games, because if you do, well, then a 2080 Ti will look like it's something like almost half the speed of an RX 5700. And obviously that's not how it actually works in real life. So this is explicitly a bandwidth test. It is built to stress bandwidth of the PCIe devices, or GPUs specifically, and that shows us, well, it helps us validate if the PCIe generation is correct on the motherboard. Doesn't really tell us anything about the graphics card performance in gaming. There are other applications where it might give you an indication, but that's not really what we care about. So just want to make that clear, because otherwise people will greatly misunderstand the data that we're presenting. The X570 and RX 5700 combination measured at 25.81 gigabytes per second in the top slot of a Gigabyte X570 motherboard, the X570 Master, or 6.5 gigabytes per second in the lowest of the slots, which is wired for x4, but is Gen 4 ready. The B550A and RX 5700 combination did about the same for top slot bandwidth, but suffers in the bottom slot, where we're bound by both the x4 limitation and the PCIe generation difference of the chipset. we also ran the 2080 Ti, which is PCIe Gen 3, in both devices, both boards, to further validate what we thought was true. In the bottom slot, we can see that the X570 board is in fact wired for Gen 4, as it's running a 3.36 gigabyte per second speed for the 2080 Ti, which is Gen 3, rather than 6.5 gigabytes per second on the RX 5700. So the difference here, obviously, because the 5700 isn't actually faster than the 2080 Ti, except for its PCIe Gen 4 enablement, the difference is that, well, the X570 lower slot is, in fact, Gen 4, because that's what's allowing it to go faster in this specific test, or at least have more bandwidth than the 2080 Ti. And a couple of other things to remember is that when you're talking about PCIe devices, you can always look at the back and count the pinout, or at least just kind of eyeball it and figure out what it's wired for. So you'll see by 16 in the instance of this particular board. And in the lower slots of some of the other boards like the X570 Master, you end up with maybe a by 4 PCIe, even though the actual slot is a by 16 length. And that's what gets confusing, because they'll market it as by 16 length, but then it might be a by 1 wiring or a by 4 wiring or by 8 if it uses half of the pins. So this ASRock board, if you look at the back of it, is wired for by 4 in the bottom slot. And in case you'd forgotten, the PCIe generations are pretty easy to remember the bandwidths of. For 3.0, it's mostly a 1-to-1. You get one lane, you get just under 1 gigabyte per second in terms of bandwidth. There's a bit of overhead there. And then for Gen 4 options, it's all 2 times higher in terms of numbers. So if you have a by 16 setup with Gen 4, you'll end up with roughly 32 gigabytes per second. And then there's overhead there too. We end up with the 25 number in the benchmarks we had. And until we have more PCIe Gen 4 devices, we can't really verify past that. SSD speeds were also as expected. We put an MT600 in here, and the M.2 slot did perform at full PCIe Gen 4 speeds. So this B550A is properly Gen 4 allowing, but it doesn't have Gen 4 on it. It's just allowing the CPU that has Gen 4 support to work properly, unlike B450 where it's locked down intentionally unless you have an older BIOS. So that wraps up the B550A chipset motherboards. There are others out there, of course. We'll try and get more of them to look at because they are interesting. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like you're going to be able to buy these, maybe later, but right now it's meant as an OEM-only stopgap solution. Proper B550 will come out at a later point, in theory, and when it does, it's supposed to be a cheaper version of X570, ideally, and potentially still have Gen 4 support. B550, specifically talking with Buildzoid, is something that he's really looking forward to working with more boards from, because of the hopes that the prices will come down from X570, which is a bit too high in a lot of ways. And that's something we can look at more. One other item of note we got in speaking with some of the partners of AMD is that it sounds like the cost difference going from something like B550A to proper full PCIe Gen 4 validation on the chipset is upwards of $17. That's cost. That does get passed on to the consumer, and it's not 1-to-1. So that's a pretty high premium to pay for the extra Gen 4 support, and that does pretty closely match what we were told earlier last year before Ryzen 3000 launched. So anyway, that's it for this one. Interesting stuff. B550A is potentially an exciting platform that you won't be able to buy. It's not exciting in the sense of being a top-end enthusiast part, but it is in the sense of being what's supposed to be a more affordable Ryzen 3000 device that supports Gen 4 for those who want it. And as a reminder, if you're wondering about if you should buy X570 or not, just remember that the answer is, do you want Gen 4? And ignoring VRM, stuff like that, and there are high-quality VRMs on X472, ignoring that stuff, if you don't care about Gen 4, PCIe at all, and you don't think you will in the life of your system, then you can save a lot of money by going for B450 or X470, because otherwise the feature set is the same. Now, when B550 proper comes out, that'll be one that's worth looking at, but we need to see how the pricing lines up and if AMD ever ships it, because it's been delayed countlessly. So that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. As always, check back for follow-ups on this content because we have a few things coming up. And you can go to store.gamersnexus.net to support us, or patreon.com/gamersnexus, and we'll see you all next time.